Hey everyone, I just want to give you a little bit of an introduction to this week's module. I've titled it African Philosophy and the Future of Social Structures, Divination, Negritude, Afrofuturism, and African Renaissance. And so I want to talk a little bit about those. There's plenty to look at and to read in the module and in our readings this week. And so if you would make sure to do the readings. They're actually quite important. I mean, they're always important, but they're important for understanding this week's content. I want to think about the notion of the future, how one might look towards the future, and how that can be a philosophical kind of thing. You might not think of philosophy as being future-oriented. Quite often, we think about ideas of being. What something is, and that we look to ground in some kind of primordial state of affairs, or perhaps in a divine cosmology of some sort, or something like that. In other words, it's looking backwards. Essentially, we figure out who we are by looking into the past, whether that's historical past or philosophical, cosmic past, whatever. Something like that. And so you might think of philosophy as being predominantly past oriented. You might also think of it as being present oriented, and you can see that certainly in elements of existentialism, for example. Existentialism is very much about living in the world as you find it right now and deciding how to live in the world right now. And so there is a certain sense there that you're not reducible to your past. You're not explained by what came before you. You rather, in terms of an act of your free will, you live in the present. And so arguments could be made for both of those kinds of orientations in philosophy. It's a little harder to find people talk about the future, although not impossible. You do have a number of philosophers in the West doing that, and what I want to do is look at African philosophy and think a little bit about the past orientation, present orientation, and future orientation. Much of what we've done in this course to this point looks back, I think, looks to the past and asks, what is it to be African? What are the conditions of thought on the continent? How are those unique in some way or other? Some of what we have looked at is very much present-oriented, especially when we talk about questions around identity. The present is then about living in the world now, and that usually means some variation on the world with all of its pain, the world with all of the ways that it has been structured to marginalize some people and privilege other people. And so that could be thought of also as a kind of present orientation with elements in the past as well. What we have this week is really, I guess, a different way to think about philosophy. And it's, one thing we're going to want to talk about is just how philosophy can engage with the idea of the future. This is a question I asked my conversation partner, Dr. Michael Onyebuchi Eze, and you have our conversation in this module. And so we talk a little bit about the future orientation as well. For our purposes here, I want to look at these four ways of thinking about the future. And the first one is what I'm calling divination, prediction, and prophecy. And so I've got some videos for you, and these are not, for the most part, scholarly work. They're videos that are in some ways quite descriptive, in some ways from enthusiasts. The only one that would be an exception to that is the one by Ron Eglash, who is a mathematician, actually, not a philosopher at all. And he talks about some of the mathematical findings that he had by talking to cultures in Africa itself. And one part of his video talks about divination practices. It's just as short as a TED Talk, so it's not that long. It's 15 minutes. And all the other videos in that section are pretty short as well. But that's what people often think about when they think about the future. They think about things like divination. So how do you know the future? Is it possible to know it well enough to make a decision on a particular course of action? And so for some people at least, when they think about Africa, they think about divination practices. And there are certainly plenty of those in various cultures to look to. I guess the question for a philosopher is how much of that is philosophical content? How much of that is, the sort of thing that we can see as having kind of defensible philosophical bases, or is it something closer to religion, simply belief in spirits and so forth, which can have philosophical content to it as well? But there's another set of questions that one could ask about this, and they're in some ways the more traditional ones of metaphysics and epistemology. What if we have an avenue into knowing something about the future? What kind of a world would we have to live in, first off, for that to be the case? It would mean that in some sense the future has a kind of solidity to it. It's not simply subject to our choices. It's that we can see it in some way. And then how does that knowledge affect the future itself? In other words, let's suppose you find something out about the future and you act upon that knowledge. What if that changes the future? And then there's also stuff about cause and effect mechanisms. If you're knowing something about the future, what would cause and effect actually mean under those circumstances? And so a lot of questions cluster around divination practices. Quite often when you see people talk about having faith in some sort of divination, whether that's in the West or in Africa, what comes with that is a particular metaphysical structure of the universe, which is sometimes involves spirits or divinities or of various sorts or whatever. And so you end up with something that there has to be an agency, there has to be something that grounds that knowledge of the future. It's not simply something that you pulled out of thin air. And we can certainly see that in some African traditional systems. So that's one approach, I suppose, to thinking about the future. Second one I want to talk about is negritude. We've already seen negritude in this course, probably more than once. So I want to look at it a little bit more this time. I've actually got some negritude poetry for you to look at. And what I'm particularly interested in, we've got a number of readings as well here, including one by Leopold Sedar Senghor, who's often thought of as a primary figure in the negritude movement, and then the contribution by Abiola Arele and Wole Soyinka. And so we've got these three readings on negritude, and I want you to think a little bit about how negritude might be future-oriented. Because quite often it's presented to us as being a kind of past-oriented sort of thing. In other words, it's an excavation of black character, African character, African rationality. It's oriented towards emotions rather than discursive rationality or logic or something like that. Put in those terms, it's very reductive and probably not true, probably not correct. But what we see is also a future orientation. And so I want you to look in the readings that we have to see if you can find any of that. In some of the writings that I've done, I've worked on a figure named Suzanne Césaire, who was the spouse for a while of Aimé Césaire, who's one of the three founding figures, commonly seen as founding figures in negritude. Suzanne Césaire, she worked in Martinique in the Caribbean, and was the editor of a journal there called Tropique, and was a playwright, and did some other things as well. And she contributed essays to that journal. And her vision of negritude is kind of mediated through surrealism, a certain sense of a view of the world that kind of unseats our kind of rational way of thinking about it, the way surrealism kind of gives us a dreamscape and a much stranger world than might seem to normal senses. But it also gives us a vision of the future, and she was very interested in what the African diaspora and Africans on the continent could move towards, what kind of future people had. And so she was really trying to write that kind of story as much as possible and push people towards that kind of story. And so there's a version of Negritude that is very much concerned about the future rather than about the past. So that's number 2 way of thinking about the future. Number 3, I guess, is the most obvious in some ways, and that's Afrofuturism. And I've got some videos there and a bunch of links to various things. We've been having a conference here in connection with the Zora Festival. Zora Neale Hurston, who, if you don't know, she lived in Eatonville, which is part of Orlando, and the Eatonville community has taken seriously her history in their place, and so they've done quite a lot over decades, really, to kind of preserve her legacy, to think about the kinds of things she was interested in. And more recently, there's been a kind of academic conference that's emerged out of that as well. And so for a few years, the focus of that conference has been on Afrofuturism. And a former faculty member at Rollins, who's now at Michigan State University, Julian Chambliss, has been involved in that, as well as my colleague Scott French in the history department at UCF. And so I've got links to some of that, there's the syllabus that they came up with and lots of other links that they have to think about what Afrofuturism actually is. I've got a bunch of other links, to exhibits and to descriptions. I've also got a couple of links to, often people have thought about the Marvel movie Black Panther as an example of Afrofuturism, and so I've got a couple of links there as well. So you can take a look at what people are trying to get at when they think about Afrofuturism. In a certain sense, it could be seen as a kind of counterfactual history. What if Africa itself or the African diaspora had not come under colonialism, had not come under slavery? What if they were able to develop a world in which they had as much agency and as much freedom as anyone else did? What might it look like? But of course it veers also into science fiction as well, and that's partly the Black Panther story, but even people like Sun Ra, and I've got a link to some Sun Ra, actually a video on Sun Ra. He was a jazz musician in the 1970s, very much seen as a seminal figure in Afrofuturism, because he's imagining like way out scenarios. He did a movie called Space is the Place, and he's a figure from space coming down, and there is this kind of crazy element to it, and yet underneath it all is this really serious kind of attempt to reimagine what it would look like for Africans to have a certain kind of pride and certain kind of hope for the future that's not encumbered by having to deal with the legacies of things like slavery and colonialism and apartheid and all the rest of it. So there are a number of videos. It's often seen as a kind of, I guess you would say, an aesthetic movement as opposed to a philosophical one. So it's worth figuring out what are the philosophical elements within this movement. It's not just about the music and the movies and the science fiction and all the rest of that. What philosophically is interesting here? Is there a vision of the future, and how does one get there? Like, what would that look like? What would the social world look like? What would the institutions look like? What would human nature have to look like? Who would we have to be in order to achieve that? What would Africans have to be? Obviously you can't just wish away the facts of colonialism. So is this just an imaginative exercise, or is there something more going on with it? So there's lots and lots of material on that, and so that's definitely worth taking a look at as well. So that's number 3. Number 4, approach to the future is African Renaissance. And this has, in some certain sense, multiple meanings or multiple senses to it. Some people look at periods in history on the continent of Africa as being a renaissance. Often when we hear the word renaissance, we think of European Renaissance, which we put after the Middle Ages and kind of as ushering in the modern era. And it's the time when we start thinking in terms of scientific method and start thinking in terms of production of art, and so states start forming, especially in Italy and all of that. So some people talk about renaissances happening in Africa as well, but probably more often it's what one writer calls a new renaissance. And so it's often used not as a kind of a period of flowering in the past, but as a view into the future. What might it look like for there to be a renaissance right now, to usher in a new era right now on the continent of Africa? And so I've got a couple of videos on that as well. They tend to be longer ones, and so you can kind of dip into them and listen to parts of them. But this question of the African Renaissance is the fourth way of thinking about the future. And again, this is a philosophy course, and so I'm interested in what the philosophical consequences or the underpinnings of that might be. For some people, an African Renaissance is going to come hand in hand with further globalization, and so therefore there are some economic assumptions happening there. For others, it's going to not be that at all. It's going to be much more focused on Africa itself, not ties to the rest of the world, and that Renaissance happens in an entirely different manner. And so, so there are a lot of different ways to think about this. And so, that's number 4. And so, this whole module really is to think about, how philosophy can contribute to thinking about a future, and what the kind of concepts are, what the kind of discussions we might have about ethics and about epistemology and about all of those sorts of things we might have to have within an African context in order to think a future that is not simply bound up with what feels sometimes like a kind of deterministic sort of pattern that is rooted in colonialism, is rooted in what comes after colonialism, with the formation of states in Africa and so forth. So that's what we're doing. This is actually a lot of fun, this material. I think, thinking about the future always is. But I think we have 4 very interesting kind of angles on how philosophy might be relevant to thinking about the future within African philosophy. So have fun, and looking forward to what you have to talk about in the module.